Welcome back, everybody, to the Teen Titans retrospective. We're kicking things off with Season 2. I still don't know how to do a good intro. Let's go. This is Season 2, Episode 1, How Long is Forever. This episode written by David Slack and directed by Alex Soto. This is a dark future episode, which is, I'm always a big fan of dark future episodes. I think they're super fun. This one in particular is extremely reminiscent of the 2003 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles dark future episode. It has a very similar structure and vibe. But let's get into the plot. So this is a Starfire-focused episode, and we open on her trying to initiate a celebration of some alien holiday that none of the other Titans have ever heard of. It's supposed to be a day of friendship and gift-giving and merriment and all that. And all the other Titans are arguing and getting on each other's nerves, just sort of not acting very friendly. This eventually makes Starfire upset, and she's worried that over time the Titans will start to drift apart and their friendships will start to unravel. Robin says, "Don't worry about it, we'll all be friends forever," which is where we get our title from. How long is forever? Then this dude shows up. His name is Warp. He's a villain from the future, and he's traveled back in time to steal this antique-looking clock from this museum. The Titans fight him. He manages to get away, and he opens a time portal back to his own time, but not before Starfire, jumps after him through this portal. Him and Starfire have this, sort of scuffle in this sort of mid-timeline clock world. I kind of love this aesthetic for, cartoony time travel where there's just a bunch of random clocks and stuff going on in the background. I think it's fun. Anyways, they wind up in the future. What turns out to be around 20 years into the future of the current timeline. Starfire goes back to the Titans Tower. She meets up with an old version of Cyborg. He tells her it's been about 20 years since Starfire has gone missing, and the Titans have sort of disbanded. I like this because we get sort of the sense that Starfire is kind of the real heart of the team and the glue that kind of keeps them all together. Starfire is the only member of the team that doesn't end up with her own, big overarching storyline, but she's incredibly important in a lot of the big and memorable character development episodes of the show, like this one. She's the linchpin and sort of the mother matriarch figure of the team, and is kind of the one that is the most invested in their friendship. Doing some quick math here, Cyborg looks super hella old, but he also points out that it's been about 20 years. Considering the Titans are teenagers in the main timeline, this would put them in at the most their late 30s. Maybe Cyborg is pushing 40. Because he appears to be one of the older members of the team, but he looks way older than that. I think you could maybe attempt to explain this with maybe Cyborg, something about his biology being kept together by machinery causes the human parts of his body to age more rapidly, or because he's being held together with sci-fi mechanics, something about that throws off his biology a little bit, maybe. But I think more this episode is a little bit symbolic and not super duper literal. The episode is ultimately about how long do you stay friends with somebody. In high school, you probably have a group of friends that you hang out with all the time, but once you're out of high school, maybe you don't see them as often. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you lose touch. And that's sort of the idea here, is it's about sort of this fear of losing your close friends and sort of a fear of the future and what the future might hold. So although 20 years really isn't that huge of amount of a time, and it looks like Cyborg has aged a lot more than 20 years, from a teenager's perspective, and this episode is from the perspective of Starfire, a teenager, 20 years seems like an insane amount of time, longer than, any of the Titans have been alive. So I think her seeing a Cyborg who's maybe in his 30s, to Starfire, he appears to be much older. However, this also gets sort of contradicted later in the episode when some of the Titans have aged much better than Cyborg, but that's sort of my perspective, is I think it's a little bit more metaphorical and playing up the like emotional concept. So Starfire's trying to reconnect with the other Titans. She meets up with Raven, who is in her white Raven outfit we've seen previously in the episode Nevermore, which kind of suggests a slightly more powerful version of Raven, although emotionally Raven is not doing well. She's just sort of alone in a room, and Starfire's like, hey, it's me, Starfire, I'm alive. And Raven's like, you're not real. I don't know what's happening, but you're definitely not real. And just is sort of shut off from the rest of the world. That's what Raven's up to. She's just locked in a room, basically. Starfire then goes to meet Beast Boy, who is also not aged well. He's like fat and bald, is in this like one-man zoo freak show P.T. Barnum type thing where he uses his powers to turn into different zoo animals. And he's being mocked by these two kids who appear to be members of the mutant gang from The Dark Knight Returns. And I have a lot of thoughts on this. Dark Knight Returns, if you're unaware, is the famous Frank Miller graphic novel about an older Batman who is like bitter and old and grizzled and like comes back out of retirement to become Batman again and fight crime and stuff. It's where they took a lot of visual inspiration for Batman v Superman, although I don't think Zack Snyder has actually read the comic. It's really good, but at one point Batman faces off against this gang of like criminals and mostly teenagers called the Mutant Gang, and they wear these like goofy sunglasses and they have like spiky hair and stuff. And in this episode of Teen Titans, they appear to be directly referencing those characters from The Dark Knight Returns, which I have some theories about. So in some of the behind-the-scenes material, the creators of the show talked about how they wanted to give Titans a sort of alternate 60s kind of vibe, in the same way that like the Batman the Animated Series had a sort of alternate anachronistic 1940s sort of vibe, which we see in episodes like Car Trouble, where like Cyborg comes in contact with like 60s greasers and stuff. And the show itself sort of has an Austin Powers 60s mod era kind of aesthetic to it. Dark Knight Returns takes place in sort of an alternate DC Universe 1980s. Okay, out in the 1980s, it's sort of playing on Cold War tropes and stuff as well. And Ronald Reagan is the president. He plays a role in relation to Superman in that storyline. So the Teen Titans Prime timeline is like sort of an alternate 60s. 20 years from that would place it in an alternate 80s, which would line up perfectly with the Dark Knight Returns alternate 80s. I'm not saying that like Teen Titans, the series, definitively takes place in the Dark Knight Returns Frank Miller continuity, but it seems to have some parallels to that continuity, which I think is interesting. So Raven and Beast Boy aren't interested in rejoining the team or figuring out how to stop Warp or fix the timeline or whatever. Starfire eventually tracks down Warp, who is also aged dramatically due to some chicanery with the time travel device. She accuses him of messing with the timeline and causing them all the Titans to like sort of disband. But Warp claims that no, actually it's a fixed timeline. Basically, Warp argues that it's predestined, that his interference was always going to happen. He's like, I stole this specific clock because according to the history books, it went missing around this time. And the reason it went missing is because I traveled back in time to steal it. So he's saying this future is always going to happen. Starfire is always going to go missing, and the Titans are always going to disband. Starfire doesn't like this idea. Around this point, she meets up with Robin, who is going by the identity of Nightwing. This is cool for many reasons. One, it's just a fun sort of fan service moment. Dick Grayson Robin, of course, eventually becomes Nightwing in the comics. In the new Teen Titans run that this show is loosely based on, this is also one of the only like instances where they directly call attention to this being Dick Grayson Robin. For most of the show, he just goes by Robin. And there's been several Robins in the comics. The show's obviously based on the new Teen Titans run, which features Dick Grayson Robin. But the Teen Titans Robin also carries many elements from Tim Drake's Robin, for example. He has the longer pants, which is more associated with Tim Drake. He also uses a staff, which is more of a Tim Drake thing in general. There's an episode later on that is based on a specific Tim Drake Robin storyline. But for the most part, although they don't explicitly state it out loud, this is Dick Grayson. He becomes Nightwing in the future. Dick Grayson is the only Robin who's become Nightwing. Nightwing takes Starfire back to his base of operations, which we see very briefly is the gear layer. The gears are back. The gear layer that Slade used. At some point, Nightwing has seemingly taken over the gear layer and is operating out of it, and it sort of looks more like a Batcave type situation. He even has his old Robin costume in a little glass container thing, just like in The Dark Knight Returns, another connection to that, but of course also just like in many other versions of Batman, where he has like the older costumes in a display type thing. Nightwing also looks pretty good. He seems to be the only member of the Titans that is actually functional, although like him being in the Slade layer is very symbolic of like him kind of going down a darker path, and obviously he's Nightwing now, which has more shades of Batman, and him having like a Batcave and him working alone and stuff again is a little more him kind of going down a darker path, following perhaps in Slade's footsteps a little bit. That seems to be the thematic implication. But he's also the only Titan that's actually like actively fighting crime still and trying to do good, so he seems to be in a mostly better place than the rest of the Titans, who are like very depressed. And as soon as he meets up with Starfire, he's like back on board for teaming up and defeating, I keep wanting to call him Clockwork, which is a character from Danny Phantom who has time-related powers, and Warp is just like not a very interesting name. I don't know, I don't like it. I want to call him Clockwork. It's not his name. Anyways, so Starfire and Nightwing team up and they go to fight Warp to try to see if they can restore the timeline, or at least return Starfire back to her original time. Nightwing also uses the Titans communicator to call out to the other Titans just in case they decide to answer. They all reluctantly do. We get a team up of all the characters again in their like sort of older form. Cyborg says booyah. We get another booyah on the counter. They defeat Warp. Cyborg is able to quickly readjust the time device in order to send Starfire back to her own time, and she returns the stolen antique clock thing, saving the day, and she recounts her whole adventure to the Titans. They reaffirm that they will continue to be friends. Robin seems intrigued by the name of Nightwing in a sort of Back to the Future, Marty, I like that name kind of way. And that's basically the episode. Although I talked for a long time, it's mostly a pretty simple structure. In some ways, I kind of wish we spent a little more time exploring each of the Titans' different future selves and like sort of what happened to them a little more, other than just they stopped being friends. The world itself also like doesn't really seem all that different, other than it's like snowy and sad looking. In comparison to the TMNT episode that is very similar, in that episode Donatello goes to the future, and it's a similar situation where he went missing in the past, and so the Turtles all disbanded, and Shredder took over, and it became like Terminator, Nazi, Shredder, fascist dictatorship. Splinter died, Casey died, Raphael's missing an eye, Michelangelo's missing an arm. It's like super dark. And then they have a huge final battle in which the other Turtles all die except for Donnie. He kills the Shredder. Karai die. It's like super dark and crazy, and especially for like a kid's show. And then it's just Donnie and April at the end, and they're like, we did it, I guess, but at what cost? And then Donnie gets like sent back to his reality. But, you know, similar themes of family of teenage heroes. One of them disappears, and without that member, the team drifts apart. Things get dark.
I lost an arm.
Exactly. Life got dark.
But then they have like one last hurrah, coming back together to save the day and help to try to make things right again. Teen Titans things don't get anywhere near that bad, which is fine. As much as I think it's cool to have an episode where things are like super dark and fucked up in the future or whatever, I think that's a really fun trope. In the case of Teen Titans, I think what works about it is it's like focused on the emotional state of the characters. And for Starfire, seeing her friends not be friends anymore is like the greatest emotional thing that could happen to her. It's like the worst case scenario. Not like that one of them died, or that like the world has been taken over by a bad guy or something. Just that they stopped being friends. that's enough. That's enough for Starfire for this future to seem completely horrible. Because the show is ultimately not really about who the bad guy is and who they have to stop and, what the state of the world is or any of that. It's about these friends who have become a family and the power of friendship overcoming adversity. And very cheesy and very sappy themes like that. This episode is full of that kind of stuff. But I like it, because shut up, I don't know. It's a show about friendship, and I think that's nice. That's why I'm not like super bothered by like the inconsistencies of some of the characters. Like Nightwing looks like he could be in his 30s, which he theoretically would be, and that seems like a reasonable age for him. Raven looks pretty much the same, but then like Beast Boy and Cyborg have aged like way worse than anyone else, which could be explained for various reasons, but ultimately I think it's more just like a metaphorical thing of like how far in the future that feels for a teenager. So I don't know, it works for me. This episode is very like sappy and very like playing up the emotions, but because the episode is from Starfire's perspective, I think it works. It's a good episode. I like it. Thank you so much for watching. We're going to continue our journey through the entire original Teen Titans series. We're now making our way through season 2. So we'll be back next week with another episode of that. And I think that's it. Subscribe. Just leave a like, leave a comment. Thank you so much for all the support recently. It's been really awesome to see. I really appreciate it. And that's it. I hope you liked it. We're going to keep going, so stay tuned for more. Bye-bye.